It's the week ending Saturday the 27th of May 1995, and this is a bonus edition of The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the Conservatives dropping their majority to 11 after the Perth by-election, Christopher Reeve receiving a life-changing injury after falling off his horse, and Everton winning the FA Cup by a single goal. And now, 25 years later, we're bringing together 3 big cheeses from The Week magazine to reminisce about its origins, how the publication has changed, and what remains reassuringly familiar about the way we view the world. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap this anniversary edition of The Week. Yes, it is the 25th birthday of The Week. And joining me for this historic occasion, we have the current editors of The Week, Theo, Tait and Carolyn Law, as well as its founding editor, Jeremy O'Grady. And before we get into the magazine itself, Jeremy, remind us of the simpler times of 1995.
Well, it was an environment in which I didn't have anything to do with journalism and knew nothing about it until some strange fellow knocked on my door called John Connell and said, a mutual friend has told me you might be interested in helping me with this magazine idea I've had. And I had been associated with so many dud enterprises before that, I thought this sounds like it's going to be another good one. So we went off to the pub and he explained to me that he was doing something totally novel. Not having a magazine with an express point of view, but a magazine which pulls all the different lines going on in the national press and tries to make a story and a pattern out of them.
In a strange sort of way, the idea, when you boil it down that simply, it's almost like a kind of pre-Twitter Twitter, isn't it?
Yes, well, one thing it certainly was pre the internet, which made the whole idea that much more novel. Now, I suppose it doesn't look quite so strange because you've got the Twitter sphere and all sorts of other online conversations going on. But at that stage, it really was novel. I'd like to take a step up from Twitter for where The Week is concerned, because it does, first of all, involve looking at the best that's been written that week on, in our judgment, the editors, the topics that are most important for that week. So there is a selective editorial view which is central to The Week, which is not central to Twitter.
Yeah, and that's something that's still relevant now, isn't it, Caroline? Some people maybe who aren't familiar with the magazine might think that because it doesn't have any opinion, it doesn't have any voice. But actually there is a kind of wry sensibility to the way the magazine's put together, which does give it a character.
Yes, I mean, it definitely has its peculiar voice, which is quite a sort of tricky one to explain, because we aren't giving people our opinions. We are giving people other opinions of the people in the newspapers, the main commentators and others. But we sort of filter that into a particular house style, which aims to be sort of reasonable, a sort of reasonable tone with whatever humour's appropriate to the subject.
I mean, when you were trying to design that voice, Jeremy, how did you filter out what was the right kind of thing and what was the wrong kind of thing? So, it must be true I read it in the tabloids. Obviously quite a cynical approach to some of the red tops. But then, you do take, for example, food and drink quite seriously and you publish restaurant reviews. So what's the deal there?
I think part of the intrinsic pleasure of The Week is the kaleidoscope between the serious, the frivolous and the entertaining. And I think from the early on, part of what guided the tone were those side headers that we have, like, it must be true I read it in the tabloid, it wasn't all bad, which cues the reader into saying, listen, these people are taking quite an Olympian perspective on this. They're looking at the news as itself a strange cultural phenomenon, which indeed it is. The whole idea of a newspaper is a very odd and very distinctively initially Western thing, which then grew and spread. But it is a strange artifact, and it's a very precarious one in the present day, and we desperately need it to survive, for The Week to survive, apart from anything else. But yes, I think the tone of the magazine kind of grew out of many hits and misses. One interesting, I hope you find it interesting anyway, but it's a very particular, tiny little point which people who try to write for The Week very often fail to see, even though it seems so obvious. When we have a commentator making a point about something, we will always say, I don't like the way the government is behaving, said Matthew Paris, rather than Matthew Paris said he didn't like the way the government was behaving. In short, we try to inhabit the persona of the particular writer, not necessarily their style, because, as Carolyn said, there is a flattening out of style. But little things like that make a huge difference to the immediacy of what one's reading. And there is a lot of sort of statecraft which goes into the making of any particular week synopsis.
And before we get on to the present, how was it putting that first issue together and getting it read and launching the magazine? It was a completely, as you say, new proposition. How did you get people on board? It
was entirely chaotic. We started off in a little garage in Paddington, which was so small that if we had to have an editorial conference, we had to go outside in the street and have it. John Connell was and still is a tremendous organiser and of Men and Machinery, and he decided that we were all going to go to this working men's club, the Cobden Club.
I wasn't expecting those to be the words that were going to come out of your mouth.
We used it as a venue. It's not that we get an audience which is necessarily could be described as working men, but there we were in the club, and we asked every single person we know, however minor the acquaintance, to come along with their address book and send out invitations to subscribe to the week and a copy of the week to everyone in their address books, on the promise, which I don't think we ever fulfilled, incidentally, on the promise that they would then get a free subscription. I can't remember what our promise was. For life, was it? No, I think, but certainly for a year. Anyway, we did. We got an assemblage of about 300 people, I think, it came along, and they all sent it to their address books, to the people in their address books.
And were you on the newsstands at this point? Was subscription only?
We were absolutely not anywhere. No, and we hadn't got on the newsstand at all. The newsstands, reluctant to take us until we had a certain profile. And clearly we had no profile at all, nor any way of sort of massaging a profile through the internet, because the internet didn't exist. But we got a lot of subscribers from that.
I mean, that's fascinating, isn't it, Theo? Because it shows that subscription, obviously through necessity, was always part of the week's business model, and that's what the week has done in the magazine industry almost better than anybody, really, was cultivate a subscriber base who like reading it every single week.
It is very important to the week even now. It's the business model is based on subscribers, many of whom have been with us for a very long time.
And what's peculiar about that was that certainly at the time that the week started, and even now, the idea of building a magazine business around subscriptions, especially for a news magazine, was really relatively novel. The assumption that we weren't going to go through, really bother with the newsstand at all, as we did not to begin with, was again quite a leap in the dark. John Connell and myself, we had managed to create quite a reputation for the magazine, but it wasn't going anywhere commercially. Not least because I insisted that it didn't have advertising, which was not a great call at the time.
What was the thinking there?
Well, the thinking was that it was just a lovely... I mean, one of the few things that's changed in the magazine is that it took advertising after the arrival of the man who changed things around for us in a commercial way, Felix Dennis. We took advertising, and we actually put a picture on the front cover, which we'd never had before.
Were you there, Caroline, when that happened, when Felix Dennis came on board?
No, I think Felix had bought into the magazine about a year or two earlier, and he was still quite a sort of major presence in a hands-off way. But he was a very benign owner in the sense that he never interfered with the editorial content in any shape or form. I think my only memory of him interfering, and certainly in those early 10 years or so that I was there, was to suggest a heartwarming story about a hamster that he'd seen somewhere in one of his local papers. He lived in near Stratford. The idea that he would interfere with the sort of political line of the week, insofar as there is one, which never crossed our minds. He wasn't in that way inclined at all. But he loved the week, which was great. He absolutely loved it.
Jeremy, for people who don't know much about Felix Dennis, can you just give us an outline of him? I mean, he's a very, very characterful owner, wasn't he?
He was one of the triumvirate, one of the trio who participated in the second most famous obscenity trial of the 20th century, the Oz trial. He had created with two Australians a scurrilous magazine. I won't go into the description of what was on the front cover when it was prosecuted, but it was being sold outside school gates. And when it was his turn to come before the judge said to him words which I think were completely formative of his subsequent career. He said, "Felix, you are easily the least intelligent of these three defendants, and therefore I'm going to give you a lesser sentence." And so he only, I think, went for a week to jail. But he was actually an incredibly intelligent man, and this must have hurt him enormously. And I think the rest of his life he went out and proved it, not least by buying the Week against the advice of his financial advisors. I was there at the time, who said, "I wouldn't touch this rag." But he said, "No, I think it's going to work."
How did you feel about that? I mean, obviously the money was nice, but how did you feel about the idea of being part of a stable that included, men's mags, things like Maxim and PC Pro, computer titles? I mean, it's very different to the Week.
Yes, and I must say, being of a conservative with a small C bent, I was not at all in favour of that idea, nor and I was also a naif, commercially speaking. I didn't realise that a large part of the success of the Week, quite apart from the brilliance of the editorial, but it's the huge engine of Dennis Publishing. The division of labour within which is something that Adam Smith would have been delighted by. It is so. They will talk about subscription marketing in 3 different divisions. They know exactly how the commercial weather for magazines is going and how to predict it. And it's really quite impressive. And without them, the Week would never have become the success it was. So although I had, to answer your question, huge reservations about joining Maxim as a magazine, it turned out to be commercially a very astute move.
I mean, Theo, you weren't at the Week in those days, but I'm guessing that since you've taken residence there, you've had a flick back through some of those older issues, pre-Felix Dennis and post. And Jeremy mentioned one of the differences was the cover. I mean, that's a big difference. What did the covers used to look like?
Yeah, as I remember, it had a series of words cut out on the front, didn't it?
It did.
And it's interesting words. It's fascinating looking back. I mean, how long did it last? How long did you last without advertising, for instance?
Oh, I think that was the first thing that Felix did, really, was to say, listen, get advertising and get it now. And of course, to do that, we had to change another thing that we loved, which was the paper stock, which in those days, were you there, Theo? Was it still that slightly...
Yeah, it was this private eye type stuff.
Private eye type, And,
right, it's like a newsprint, basically.
But I think it was necessary to get in the big cheese advertisers, and, it was part of the whole drive to up the stakes.
Theo, let's talk about how an issue gets put together, both in kind of normal times, if you like, and then in quarantine times. So before we were all on lockdown, what was the usual process? How many days does it take? What's the effort? How do contributors choose what goes in?
Well, we all read a great deal of newspapers. That being the editorial team, which is, I think, 6 in total. And then we all get together for an editorial meeting and try and bang out what the sort of 7 or 8 stories of the week are going to be. And we used to do this in our offices, and now we do it all on Zoom like everyone else does everything, which was initially a great shock to us. But it's sort of reasonably smooth now, isn't it?
It's more work.
Is it difficult to get the balance of light and shade that's kind of part of the brand when so much of the news is so depressing?
I was really worried about that at the beginning, that it was just going to become incredibly dark. But actually, I think it's quite interesting that it has become utterly preoccupying, of course, for the newspapers. And so we spend all our time reading about lockdown virus issues. But it's a bit like Brexit was for 4 years before that, where you start to find that the usual sort of rivalries and debates spring up, and it becomes sort of strangely knockabout again in a rather more worrying circumstances, but people taking it in the same kind of way. So you find your path through, and there's still other things going on. And then, of course, with this particular crisis, there's been an awful lot of positive news. It's far easier now. We have a section called Wasn't All Bad, where we try to find positive things that have happened in the news, which in normal times can actually be very difficult. People have said to me, couldn't you have a whole page of Wasn't All Bad? And I've had to say, well, actually, we find it quite difficult to find 3 little tiny stories. But now it's really quite easy. There's an awful lot of good news out there, which certainly helps to leaven things. And as Jeremy was saying earlier, we've always tried to have on each page, or on most pages at least, of hard news, something that leavens it, whether it's the tabloid stories or gossips or Wasn't All Bad.
And you've talked about scouring the newspapers. The first thing you do is go through all the news websites. You talk about all the stories that are around. How do the news organisations that you are taking stories from view you, do you think, Theo? Because on the one hand, obviously, you're promoting They're columnists, for example, and if you like a particular idea, you might go and seek out the newspaper, but I suppose they can say you're cannibalising our content. Why would someone buy our magazine when you're summarising it for us?
I mean, it seems to be the model for a newspaper is that it's going to give a particular group of readers a particular political perspective, and we just don't do that at all. And I think, that obviously in copyright there's no copyright on the expression of ideas, and you are allowed to use you're allowed to quote a certain amount in fair use.
So one of the things that you're famous for is your briefings, taking a complex, often international story and explaining it in a way that means that someone on one page gets all the information they'd need to hold their own in the pub. Theo, how are those written? Because I imagine it's actually a lot more complicated to do than it seems to read.
Yeah, it's a sort of multi-stage process. Now, what happens is we have one journalist who does an initial go on it, which is sort of a day and a half's work going through everything they can possibly read about it. Then it goes on to me, and I then edit, reread, try and read as much as I think I need to read, and then I knock it on to Jeremy. And so it's a sort of it's like everything with the week, that most newspapers get to say things 3 or 4 times in each article. We really only get to say things once. So when you say it, you have to be very clear about what you mean, and you have to get it right. And quite often when you crunch things down, it comes out a bit strangely. So this is why we have this sort of multi-reading, multi-editing process. And we do that really for every page, but maybe particularly for the briefing.
Can I add to what Theo has just said by saying that the initial model for this was the British spy Kim Philby. In one of the early biographies of Philby, there's an interesting account of how his seniors in the Foreign Office helped his meteoric rise within the Foreign Office because they were so impressed with his unique skill. One was quoted as saying, the thing about Philby is that he gives you the briefing on one compact page and everybody else gives us 5 pages of drivel. So that was what kind of inspired the idea of a good briefing was Kim Philby. And it's worth saying that is an entirely novel page. That's the week is made up of various different components, and the briefing is one of the pages which is entirely original.
Carolyn, what's your favourite bit of the magazine?
I have either edited or written the obituaries for 22 years, and it's certainly my favourite bit to do. I don't really sort of read it as a reader, so I don't get the enjoyment out of it that we hope our readers get. But in terms of actually writing the magazine or editing the magazine, I'm quite devoted to the obituaries page. I think obituaries are unusual in journalism, and they're really more of a sort of story. There's a sort of arc to them, and you're obviously not as forensic. You don't have to be as forensic in the detail, because there's a sort of, unless you're doing literally of an arch villain, there's a leaning to the positive. So after a sort of rather sort of exhausting week of, well, it was Brexit for a long time and now it's coronavirus, I quite like spending Thursday and Friday looking at the obituaries, because they are often more human and sometimes fun or heartwarming.
There's an art of euphemisms around obituaries as well, isn't there? And famously in the old days, lifelong bachelor, that kind of thing. What are you looking for when you're pouring through the clippings?
Well, for us, the newspaper obituary is obviously much, much longer. So, for instance, if you had a famous writer, there would be an awful lot of it. There'd be a list of their books and what the books were about. Because we've only got sort of maybe 500 or 700 words, which is an absolute fraction of what they have, we tend not to focus on that. And a good obituary in our format is often either a particular focus on a time and a place. And one of the ones I really enjoyed doing was the man who invented matchbox cars, and that was just a sort of interesting phenomenon that existed for a long time in Britain, was matchbox cars. So that was quite fun. But other times it can be just the arc of a story. The dam buster who joined the RAF age 16 from the insurance firm who'd just joined as a clerk, and after the war went back to the insurance firm and retired as its managing director. That sort of thing. They just make good stories. So you have to look for a story. There has to be a sort of a beginning and an ending, if you like, to work in our format. Not necessarily, but that really helps. And those are really they're just nice to write. I hope they're nice to read, but I enjoy writing
Well,
them.
it's nice to hear you're the person who writes them, because another sort of, I guess, aesthetic decision of the Week magazine is no one gets a byline. Apart from you, Theo, you do get a little box on the front, don't you, with your name in it, where you write a very small kind of leader, I guess. Is that your favourite bit? I'm going to guess not.
we all take turns on that. It goes in strict rotation. But well, no, because in a way you get quite addicted to the thing of not taking a position on anything. And I think Kaz and Jeremy would also find this, that you sort of get to a point where you don't really have any very strong views about everything, because you're constantly thinking, well, there's one side, and then what's the other side to it. So yeah, no, I mean, I usually just use that to draw attention to something interesting that I saw, rather than to express an opinion, of which I have very few.
What's your favourite bit, Theo?
I like doing the briefing, just because it's just quite fun to try and burrow down and try and get to what you think the really important questions are and what the answers are to them.
What about you, Jeremy? What do you think really jumps out as something that the Week does?
Well, I'm much like the Week readers. Whenever we do a survey, we know what their favourite page is without even having to ask them. It's the property pages, and I'm responsible for my favourite bit of the weekly ritual is choosing which houses to select to look beautiful on the property porn page. I had an interesting encounter in the days when we still took public transport on a train going to Oxford, and the woman opposite me sat down and took out a copy of the Week, and I said, "Oh, that's my magazine." And she looked very abashed, and she said, "No, it isn't, it's mine." And I said, "No, what I mean is I helped produce this magazine." And so then we got talking, and she said, "You'll never guess what my favourite page in the magazine is." And I said, I know what it is. It's the property page." She looked rather crestfallen and said, "Yes, it is. But it's certainly mine."
Has anyone ever got in touch and said that they've bought one of those, £2.3 million houses by the lake somewhere?
We have had a couple, yes, of people who have credited. I don't know why the estate agents don't send us very many more, because it's wonderful free advertising for them. But anyway, we do get enough.
Carolyn, why do you think it's endured after all these years? 1,280 editions. What is the secret?
I think the Week was just incredibly lucky in a way, because it sort of it could have been destroyed by the internet, but somehow it seemed to flourish after that. It was counterintuitive in a way. I thought I thought we were really threatened, and of course there are always threats to a magazine industry, but the internet has been only in terms of the advertising, not in terms of the editorial. I think because people now have so much news, the idea of a curated selection, I mean, we never used the word curated when we started, but it is what it effectively is, has become more necessary and more enticing to the reader, who are now faced with so much news, and also so much news that they're not sure they can rely on. So in a way, I think we've been very lucky that it was a sort of peculiarly well-timed.
And I mean, it's a bit crude to talk about the current situation as having silver linings, but actually, for your business model, Theo, it is a product, isn't it, that people get through their front door and are more likely, in a way, if they're at home all the time, to want to sit down and read on the sofa than perhaps other print publications they'd have to go out to pick up, or online publications when they've spent all day looking at conference calls.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think people do like a little paper magazine to read, and you can read it in the bath or whatever. But also, I think it's quite a soothing product, and I think that's quite nice in anxious times. It's not, you don't feel battered, and it's not like watching the news at 10 at the moment or something, which is a pretty miserable experience.
And Jeremy, did you ever think 25 years ago that you would be here in this situation in 2020? You've got an American edition of The Week as well, The Week Junior, and all the various other spin-offs, including this podcast, of course. Do you think it'll still be with us in 25 years' time?
I very much hope so. I mean, it's given me a career, a wife, and 25 years of headache. I don't see why that shouldn't continue for another 25 years.
Well, on that very positive note, happy birthday, all of you. And thanks again to Carolyn Law, Jeremy O'Grady and Theo Tait. That is it from this special edition of The Week Unwrapped. Congratulations to all the team here for all their work over the years. If you want to Join the legion of subscribers we've been discussing. You are in luck because we have a great deal for you. Just for listening to this podcast, you can claim 6 free issues and a free Moleskine notebook by going to theweek.co.uk and entering the promo code POD25. That is theweek.co.uk/offer and the promo code POD25. And you can get new episodes of The Week Unwrapped, of course, for at least the next 25 years, I'm sure, when you subscribe via your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producers Sarah Miles and Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.